Some of you might feel like, well, gosh, we've been working on ecology for a long time, since the start of the year, and you're right, but just, I'm not telling you that like, this should change how you feel about it. Like, you might like it, you might not, but just for perspective, like, people spend their entire careers studying ecology. When I was in college, there was no, I went to the University of Washington for my science degree, and there was no ecology major. So but I put together a program where I was taking botany and zoology courses, because that was the closest we could come to. And so I took, you know, like 10, 12 classes that were specifically aimed at ecology. I spent years looking at ecology, and the people that I was working with, the professors that were teaching the courses, had spent decades doing it. So there's no shortage of stuff to look at and think about with ecology, and I'm not gonna, it happens to be sort of my focus in biology. I'm not gonna try to persuade you that it's more important than any other kind of like biological field, but I will say it's something that's relevant to everybody, because every single one of us, no matter what you like, no matter what your take is on things, no matter how you interact with the world, on some level, you're functioning as part of an ecosystem. And so knowing about this is relevant to everyone, in a way that some other things maybe aren't, like genetic engineering maybe isn't as relevant to you personally, but certainly understanding how we fit into the ecological puzzle is something that's worth thinking about. So what we've been focusing on so far, up until now, what we've really been thinking about are these like investigations that we can do, where we're looking at like what is an actual like interaction between two organisms. How can we characterize that interaction? How can we collect data about it and interpret the data? And we're shifting to talking about some things that are more theoretical. This is stuff we could be collecting data on, but it's a lot trickier to look at. And so some of the work that we're going to be doing is more theoretical. It's more cerebral, which I think it's still going to be interesting. I think it's still going to be really interesting to everybody. But what we're doing is we're going to explore it in some different ways. And today what we're going to be doing is using a computer simulation to investigate, in particular, some predator-prey relationships. And as part of that, what I want to think about is, so every single living organism on this planet and off this planet, if there are any, absolutely has to get energy from somewhere. Every single living organism on this planet uses carbon as a building material. So all organisms need energy and they need carbon. And there's a whole bunch of ways to get that. And one of the interesting things to think about with predator-prey interactions is that what we're really focusing on to a certain degree is where does the carbon come from and where does the energy come from. When we look at predator species, those tend to be, those are almost all organisms that get their energy and their carbon from other living organisms. When we look at the prey species, they get their carbon and their energy largely from other living organisms as well, although not 100%, but pretty close, but they get it in a different way. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to switch to thinking about some of the interactions between organisms in terms of what we call food webs and trophic levels. Those are ways that we can characterize where organisms get their energy and carbon, all right? So the skills that we're looking at here are largely going to be skills of identification, and your job is going to be to think about if we talk about an organism, given enough information about it, can you identify where it would be on a food web, and can you identify like what role it plays in terms of these things called trophic levels? And then more importantly, and what we're gonna really focus on with the simulation today, is can we make predictions? If we know enough about the interaction of organisms, the roles they play in a food web, where they get their energy, where they get their carbon, can we make some predictions about what will happen if one organism becomes more or less abundant? And that is a really interesting ecological problem, because as you probably remember, the central question in ecology is, why do organisms live where they do in the abundance that they do? So changes to the abundance of living organisms is really central to the question of ecology. And as always, what I'm going to ask you to do, everybody should write down the stuff that I underline. Some of you love to just write, and that's awesome. You can write whatever you want, but I'm going to give you time to write down what I underline, and you may not have time to write down everything else. So when we look at a food chain, what we're looking at is a list of organisms, and sometimes those organisms are broken down by species, like really specific things, like a species of like insect, like a mosquito, or a particular plant, like an avocado plant. Other times we're just looking at more general things, like carnivore or phytoplankton. There's lots of different organisms that fall into those categories. So we might be looking at species, or we might be looking at larger groups. And essentially what a food chain shows is who eats what. And one thing that this is not going to be something where, like, you're not going to get tripped up on this. This isn't going to be something that comes back to bite you in terms of points. And it's easily correctable. But when you look at the arrows on a food chain, they always point to the organism that is doing the eating. So if we look at this food chain here, this plant has an arrow pointing to an herbivore, a cricket. The plant is being eaten by the cricket. Then there's an arrow from the cricket to the mouse. The cricket is being eaten by the mouse. And having that arrow point the right direction, when you're first working with food chains, doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But if you are really used to looking at food chains, the direction of the arrow can be really confusing if it's pointing wrong. So for my sake, if no other reason, as you make food chains and food webs, which you'll see in just a second, make those arrows point the right way, because otherwise I look at them and my brain just I can't deal with it. So the arrows always point toward the organism that's doing the eating. And the thing about a food chain is it generally just shows part of the picture. It doesn't show all of the organisms that are potentially interacting. It just shows relationships between a subset. And a lot of times, that is really all we need. A lot of times we're interested in one or maybe two particular organisms. And it might be that those one or two organisms, like maybe the snake and maybe the cricket, they may have kind of a sort of a set target in terms of their prey. So when we think about the cricket, which I guess flower's not prey, right? But that's its food source. So maybe this particular cricket really only eats this flower. And maybe this particular snake really only eats mice. It eats some other stuff, but mostly mice. In that case, a food chain might be a really effective way of thinking about the abundance of those two organisms. Because what's really going to matter is how many of these flowers are there, because that's going to tell us about the grasshoppers. And how many of these mice are there, because that's going to tell us about the snakes. There are other organisms in this hypothetical environment. You all could imagine there's going to be lots of other insects, lots of other plants, there's lots of other rodents, there's lots of other reptiles and amphibians, and lots of other birds and mammals, and they're just not on here. And that's because if we start listing all of those things, it really gets out of control in a hurry. The really complicated food webs that are designed by computers we can't look at them and really see any useful information. They're so complicated that they only become useful when we look at parts of them. Food chain is the simplest part of a food web. A food web shows more organisms, usually not all, but sometimes all, but typically it shows all possible food chains among a larger group of organisms. Same deal as before. Sometimes it might be a really specific, it might identify different species of spider. Other times it's more general, like there's lots of different species of squirrel, but they're all lumped together on this particular food web. And there are other organisms in this ecosystem as well. There's no like ants on here. I mean, we have some beetles, and we have some predator beetles, and we have some like herbivorous beetles, but I don't see ants on there. So maybe there's flies, and there's all sorts of other kinds of organisms that don't show up here. But the ones that are here, we're not just showing a simple chain that has one organism eating another organism. It's showing, for example, that mice are eaten by foxes and hawks and owls and snakes. So we're showing more of the possibilities. And just like food chains, the arrows point to the organism doing the eating. And again, I'm not going to come after you in terms of points for this. Like if you are drawing a food chain, I might tell you, oh, hey, will you switch your arrows? But it turns out as you get used to working with these, you'll find, oh yeah, being consistent with the arrows makes a lot of sense. Like for example, here, where we have these organisms, spiders and predaceous insects, we have the arrows going both ways. And it's kind of nice to be able to like think, oh well, this top arrow is showing the predaceous insect being eaten by the spider, and this bottom arrow is showing the spider being eaten by the predaceous insect. By the way, I'm not going to be able to get it right now, but I have a video of an awesome insect encounter. I went camping with my kids this summer, and as we were packing up on the last day that we were there, a yellow jacket flew into the tent, and so, but there was all our stuff was out of it, so we were just like, well, that's okay. And then a bald-faced hornet flew into the tent, and then the bald-faced hornet killed the yellow jacket and ate it. And if you've never seen like one terrifying stinging insect eat another terrifying stinging insect, it's terrifying. So we'll watch that. I've got that somewhere. I don't know where it is, but it'll be really fun to watch. Okay. And the thing about a food web is you get more information. It's way more complete. You get to see a lot more of the picture, but it comes at the cost of added complexity. Like if you want to know who eats what here, you have to kind of trace the arrows. Like you have to go from the plants, you have to follow the arrow to the seed-eating birds, and then follow that arrow to the snakes to really figure out, who's eating what in that particular part of the food web. If you just look up here and you ask yourself, what do foxes eat? You can't just look down and see it. You have to follow the arrows to get there. So there's a little bit more interpretation, and as we add organisms, it just gets more and more and more complex. So typically, what we do is we kind of think of them in terms of how we can get the best of both worlds. So for example, we might think about a food chain in which we have algae, which is not a plant, but it's, it's photosynthetic, so a lot of times people think of it as plant. Those are eaten by tiny little organisms called krill. They're kind of like little shrimp, like they're almost so small, they're invisible. Those get eaten by fish called cod. Those get eaten by leopard seals, and those get eaten by killer whales. And if we were to think about this food chain, we could also identify it in the context of a larger food web. So if we think about the food web that involves a lot more organisms, we can see if we start with algae, those get eaten by, they get eaten by cod, and they get eaten by small animals and one-celled organisms, but what we're interested in particular is that they get eaten by krill. And then krill, they get eaten by penguins, but they also get eaten by cod. And cod get eaten by leopard seals, and leopard seals get eaten by orcas or killer whales. And so when you look at a food web and a food chain together, sometimes you get the most information. Typically what we would do is like look at the food web, pick out a food chain, and then think about that food chain sort of in isolation. Now, with computers, we often don't have to do that. With computers, a lot of times what they do is they program in these interactions, and you'll see some examples of this in just a second. They program in these interactions, and you can sort of change the interactions. And it's way, way, way above the level of anything that we're going to be looking at in this class, but it's kind of fun to think about, and so I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. But this is typically how we would investigate food webs. When we think about food webs, we're just thinking about who eats what. Another way of thinking about the interactions, the predator-prey or the consumption interactions in an organism is in terms of what we call trophic levels. And what trophic levels do is they give a name or they show the position that organisms occupy in the food chain. And that effectively is going to help us figure out where they get their energy and where they get their carbon. That's kind of the real key piece here. Where do they get their energy and where do they get their carbon? Those are the two critical ingredients that organisms really need that can come from a variety of sources. Hi. Thank you. And so we break down these trophic levels into a bunch of different categories. And so the good news is much of this information is really kind of extra. Like a lot of this stuff we really don't need to think about. But we do need to be able to think about the three main categories. One are producers, which are often called autotrophs. And producers use typically sunlight, but sometimes other chemicals to create, and to like, that's where they get their energy and their carbon. So we'll look at the process of photosynthesis down the road, but effectively what photosynthesis does is it takes energy from the sun and it takes carbon from air and puts them together in a molecule called sugar that has carbon and stores energy. So producers use sunlight and air to get energy and carbon. Consumers, on the other hand, don't have the ability to use air or sunlight. They not to get energy or to get carbon. So instead, they eat other organisms. So we've got producers that can use sunlight and air to get carbon and energy, and consumers that have to eat other organisms. And then there's this special category called decomposers. And decomposers decomposers are really cool. And the thing about decomposers is you kind of know them when you see them. And basically, what the deal with decomposers is that we didn't know anything about them for a long time. We didn't know that decomposers were living things because you generally can't see them. So if you take an apple and you just leave it sitting out for a while, eventually it like develops little brown spots, and then it starts to get squishy, and then it just sort of like collapses, and then it disappears, and eventually it's gone. And people call that decomposition because it used to be an apple and now it's just a sludge. And even when we see like bread, when you take a piece of bread and leave it out, and then pretty soon it starts to get like white patches on it, and then it like sprouts hair, and then the same thing happens. Like it eventually like just sort of melts away to nothing. And when it's all said and done, you used to have bread, and now you have nothing. Well, now we know that what's really going on there is there are tiny organisms, largely bacteria and fungi, that are eating things. They're just consumers, but they're just really small consumers, and they are so effective at converting other organisms into energy and carbon that there's not much left when they're done. And we have sort of expanded our definition of decomposer. Now that we know that that's what they do, now we think about some other organisms as decomposers. Like there are some insects that live in the soil that we think of as decomposers. Like a lot of times people will think of worms as decomposers, or little bugs called springtails, we'll think of those as decomposers. And so the definition of decomposer has gotten a little squishy over the years as we've moved from not knowing what caused it to understanding that decomposition is really just like a form of consumers. It's just that they just, like, dead, dying stuff gets eaten by decomposers. And then the outcome is whatever they eat just sort of vanishes. We just don't see any trace of it, right? And that's really different from the other kind of consumers where you have like a lion. If a lion eats a deer, it's gonna eat like a bunch of it, but there's gonna be a carcass there, and then there's lion poop all over the place. And like you could sort of say like, well, that skeleton there and the hide was part of the deer, and that big pile of lion poop was part of the deer. But when a decomposition happens, you end up with just like nothing. There's nothing left, and so you don't really see that evidence that that organism was consumed and used as part of a different organism. When we think about trophic levels, they're easiest to look at in the context of a food chain. And typically those trophic levels are associated with the direction in which the kind of the food moves up the food chain. And what happens is that we generally start with producers, and sometimes we'll call that like trophic level 1. And then the next level is going to be what we call primary consumers. So like the cricket is a primary consumer. You don't really need to worry about the primary part of it. Sometimes it might be really important to know whether something's a primary consumer or not, but usually we just think about something as, well, is it a producer or is it a consumer? And then when you move up a little bit more, you might get to what we call a secondary consumer. And a secondary consumer largely will eat primary consumers, although if you think about the food webs, things get pretty complicated pretty quickly. There might be some secondary consumers that also eat producers, so they're sort of primary and sort of secondary consumers. And again, the primary, the secondary, that doesn't really matter. And if there's another level of consumers, which there often is, those might be called tertiary consumers. And if there's another level, which there might be, those might be called quaternary consumers. And we don't need to use those terms. We're not going to use those terms. But what is kind of interesting to think about is whatever the very highest level is, we call the top predator. It's the organism that doesn't get eaten by anything else, except decomposers, but we usually don't show decomposers when we think about trophic levels. So really what we are kind of thinking about is the idea that we have producers that get their energy from sunlight and they get their carbon from air. And then we have consumers, and there might be a variety of levels of consumers. Some of them eat plants, and some of them eat other consumers, and they might do both, might have like organisms like us, we eat plants, and most people eat some form of animal as well. And then we have the top predator. And the top predator is worth thinking about because often that one is extra important. If nothing eats that, then its presence or absence can sometimes have an outsized effect on the rest of the organisms in the food web. And we looked at that already. It's not unusual for the top predator in a food web or food chain to be a keystone species. We talked about that when we were talking about community interactions. So that keystone species is not always the top predator, but often it is. So that's why we kind of think about, well, you know, in any particular ecosystem, it might be worth trying to figure out which organism is the top predator, okay? And just to kind of give you some examples of organisms from these different trophic levels, if we were to think about producers, and I mentioned this before, producers are also called autotrophs, and it gets really crazy because you could be like a chemoautotroph or a chemoheterotroph, and there's like basically what we really want to think about is where do organisms get carbon? Where do they get their energy? In general, we think about producers as being plants, and then there are some algae too, and some bacteria. Not all algae are producers, not all bacteria are producers, and they capture energy from sunlight or sometimes other chemicals. So like this right here is something called a black smoker. Have you guys heard of that? These are in deep ocean environments. And these black smokers are this is like organic chemicals, like petroleum chemicals deep in the earth that are coming out under pressure, and they're sometimes really hot. And they have a lot of compounds in them like oil and other petrochemicals, and they have other chemicals like hydrogen sulfide. There are producers that get their energy from the chemicals in these environments, and they never see sunlight. They don't get energy from sunlight. They get energy from like hydrogen sulfide or hydrocarbons. There are other organisms that work a little bit differently from how we typically picture plants working. So there's some organisms like in hot springs or really extreme environments that maybe they get their energy from one kind of chemical and they get their carbon from a different kind of chemical. And they don't need sunlight, but they also aren't consumers. So those are kind of outliers, but typically what we think about with a producer is that it gets energy from sunlight and it gets carbon from the air, carbon dioxide in the air. We'll look at that in more detail when we talk about photosynthesis down the road. And then heterotrophs. So we can think about heterotrophs as being like consumers and decomposers. And then sometimes it's kind of interesting to think about, well, what kinds of consumers do we have? And this is something I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with, because when we think about how heterotrophs get their energy, they have to get it from other organisms. So they get their energy and their carbon from other organisms. They can eat different types of organisms, and sometimes it's interesting to think about that. So sometimes we think about herbivores that only eat plants, and most of you have heard that term before. With humans, we sometimes refer to that as a vegetarian, but with other organisms like deer, we would say that deer are herbivores. And then there's carnivores that eat other animals, and really only other animals. So those are going to be things like, like the fast predators, like coyotes and cougars and lions and things that are like, they don't eat veggies. And then there's omnivores that can eat both plants and animals. That would be most humans eat plants and animals. You get some energy and carbon from plants, some energy and carbon from animals. And then the decomposers, which they're equal opportunity. They can break down pretty much anything. And so we don't think of them as herbivores or carnivores or omnivores, though, because they don't kind of kill and consume the whole thing. Like we, right now, every single one of us, are covered with decomposers. But our body regenerates and fights off those decomposers. If we have some bacteria on our skin that is decomposing our skin, we just make new skin, so we don't go away. And decomposers really only do their job when the organism that they're consuming is dead or dying. So all of these things are just ways that we can think about the feeding relationships between other organisms or between different organisms. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at a relatively small scale food chain. Let's see. Okay. And the simulator itself, it looks a little tricky at first, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it so you'll get a chance to see what it looks like. The big skills that we're going to be working on today is how well can you predict changes in abundance of one organism or a set of organisms if you know the change in abundance of a different organism. And we want to do some data interpretation. So the data that you're going to see is mostly going to be in graphical form. And in this case, we're going to be looking at data showing predator-prey relationships. And then we're going to practice some of the work that we were just looking at, which is identifying trophic levels and thinking about the roles that organisms play in food webs. So the simulation itself, I'm just going to show you, like, it uses, it's kind of old school. It uses these symbols that are awfully hard to see to indicate 3 different kinds of organisms. And you can see what you're actually looking at. If you click View Simulation Key, you can see what the different organisms are. And I can't identify these without my reading glasses on because I'm just too old. So, but you can see the abundance of grass, which is a producer. You can see the abundance of young and adult rabbits, and you can see the abundance of young and adult wolves. And if you click on the button that says View Population Graph, it'll show you a graph, and nothing is happening yet. So we're not seeing any changes, but if we start the simulation by clicking Start Simulation, and then click View Population Graph, you can see that we're going to start to see some changes in the relative levels of grass, which is the green line, wolves, which is the red line, and rabbits, which is the blue line. And I'm not gonna run the whole thing because I want you all to play around with it. But the idea here is to think about how the abundance of these organisms changes as the abundance of the other organisms change. They're all sort of interdependent. And one of the things that I just want to show you that I think is really neat is this piece right here. And we're not going to play around with this, but this is where the computers come in. If you click View Modify Parameters, you can see that rabbits have their own set of constraints and requirements. So they live to the age of 25, and there's a 50% chance that they'll reproduce at each step. And they can't reproduce until they're 10. And the most they can eat is 45, pieces of grass or whatever. And we can change that, which is kind of, we could play around with it and see, and we could modify the wolf parameters and the startup parameters, like how many rabbits and wolves and how much grass there is. And so there's all sorts of stuff that you can play around with potentially. And this is what real ecologists do, is they play around with these sorts of models to try to make predictions about how populations will change over time. What you all are going to do is keep it simple. And so there's some steps here where you're running the simulation and describing some patterns that you see in the changes in populations. And then there's some reflection questions where you're trying to identify the reason that these predator-prey and herbivory relationships might be causing the changes that you're seeing. What I want is for you to go through the simulation, like you can collect the data, you can look at the simulation, you can talk about it in pairs, but as you record information, either in this document or on a sheet of paper, I want you to be recording what you're thinking and what you're noticing here. And it's 2:20. I say let's take a 5-minute break and get back in here and starting to work on the simulation at about 2:25. Does anybody have any questions before we break?